So, who wrote the Gospel of Judas? Well, that's a pretty interesting question, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So, what can we say about this author, the fellow who wrote the Gospel of Judas? Well, it's very difficult to know because, as with most early Christian texts, we do not have any information about who the author was, or any information that comes from the texts, or shall I say that we don't have any information about the texts from outside the text. Usually we just have internal evidence. And many of these early Christian writings are either anonymous or they're pseudepigraphical, which means the author speaks in the voice of someone other than who he actually is as a person. But that does not keep historians from knowing something about the ancient author, or the author of the Gospel of Judas, or anything like that. So today, this is what we're going to talk about. So for those who either forgot or do not know about the Gospel of Judas, here's a little summary of the text just to make sure that everyone is on the same page. So it is a non-canonical gospel that was published in 2006 by National Geographic. It was discovered a little bit before then, but that's when it was made known to the general public. So there's only one 3rd century copy of it in existence, and it's a Coptic manuscript that's inside of an ancient book called Codex Chakos. Ancient historians suggest that it was originally written in Greek by the middle of the 2nd century. And of course, it purports to record a secret revelation given to Judas by Jesus before the betrayal and crucifixion. And as far as the interpretation of the text goes, pretty much everybody agrees that it is designed to subvert the traditional meaning of Jesus' death. So I guess we can get one candidate out of the way. The author was certainly not Judas Iscariot himself. As you know, there are gospels that claim to have been written by a particular apostle of Jesus or something like that. But most of the time, it's very difficult to prove that this was the person who wrote the text. The Gospel of Judas is no different, and it seems to be very easy to argue against the idea that Judas wrote this text. So here are about 3 points of internal evidence from the text that would suggest that Judas is not the author. And again, internal evidence just means evidence from within the text itself, without any external consideration. So the first, of course, is that the narration is in the 3rd person. In other words, Judas does not speak in his own voice in this gospel. And I have an example over here on the side, which is the very first part of the Gospel of Judas. And here's the Coptic at the top. And don't ask me a lot of details about the text because I'm not really trained in Coptic. Not yet. I'll take it in a year or two at my school. But I figured I would put it up here for those of you who are interested in Coptic or maybe know a little bit of the language. But the translation is down here, and it says, "The secret discourse of the proclamation in which Jesus spoke with Judas Iscariot." So I'm getting this text and the translation from Jenna, who wrote a dissertation called The Gospel of Judas in 2011. There is actually a more recent translation of the Gospel of Judas from, I think, 2021 or 22, something like that. It's very recent, hot off the press. And I went browsing through the racks of the library at my school where I'm doing my doctorate, and the call number that was on that was assigned to the book I was looking for was actually on a different book in a different section of the library. So I don't know what happened there. So in any case, I wasn't able to find this newer book, so I went with the next best thing I could find, which was this. But it seems to be just fine for our purposes. So the second reason that we know the author wasn't Judas was that the gospel was written originally in Greek. But as we know, Judas would have spoken Aramaic, because he would have been kind of from the Judea or the Galilee area, the same place that Jesus and the apostles would have been from. And so additionally, of course, it's highly questionable that he would have known how to write or even read. And again, this third point isn't really what you would say internal evidence to the text, but it follows from the internal evidence of the text. In other words, we know the text is written in Greek. Judas probably couldn't write or read Greek, and so it follows therefrom that Judas would not have written it. Now, you might be wondering, why are we spending so much time talking about why the author wasn't Judas? Well, that's mostly just to shut down some of the more adventurous people who want to argue that the esoteric knowledge provided in the text is actually historical, or really goes back to Judas himself. But that's why we're talking about this point. But anyway, let's look at the external evidence suggesting that Judas was not the author. One, of course, the author clearly knows at least one of the canonical Gospels, likely Mark. At least that's what my advisor has to say. So if Judas were the author of this text, writing not in his own voice, why would he steal information from another gospel if he were an eyewitness? You know, that's a little that would be a tricky question to answer. And then two, the cosmology and theology of the text hardly resemble what Jews from Judea and Galilee believed in the 1st century A.D. We'll talk about this a little bit later in our little feature today. But Judas and the apostles and the Jews of that time didn't have this elaborate cosmology that this text seems to resemble. This text is from a later time, 100 years or so after the 1st century, or the time in which Jesus would have lived. However, the text does match the historical situation of the 2nd century. So anyway, that's just a couple of things that we could say about Judas. So what can we say about the true author? Well, ancient historians, of course, cannot pinpoint exactly who the author is, but we can determine what kind of person he was and when he lived. So he certainly was a 2nd century Sethian Gnostic. But what exactly is that? What is a Sethian Gnostic? Of course, a lot of you probably are familiar with the Sethians. They're pretty much the most high-profile, famous ancient Gnostic group. But the Sethians were individuals or groups of people who authored some of the classic Gnostic texts of antiquity. And good examples would be the Apocryphon of John, or the Apocalypse of Adam, and of course, the Gospel of Judas. And we know that these texts came from a similar group or school of thought because they share many similar features. Similar to how the Gospel of John and the Epistles of John share similar features, and thus probably came from a group of related individuals. So because a sizable collection of related texts exists, this is the reason that scholars infer that there was some kind of school of thought, or maybe even an actual organized church of Christians, or people who self-identified as Christians. And their interpretation of Jesus' life clearly differed from those of the proto-Orthodox Christians. So these people, the Sethians, existed by the middle of the 2nd century, but it is very difficult to figure out their exact origins. So at the very least, it is clear that they were an esoteric alternative to the public faith of the proto-Orthodox. So let's go through some of their characteristic beliefs, and it can be difficult to summarize these, but I found a good article in the Encyclopedia of Ancient History. And here is what Turner has to say, who's an expert on the Gnostics, and specifically the Sethians. So these people viewed themselves as the spiritual descendants of Seth, which was Adam's son. They also believed in a supreme mother, father, and child deity. So they had their own take on the Trinity, basically. They had their own version of a triune Godhead, more or less. They also thought that there was an evil lower God who created the world, and this was the God that the Sethians hoped to escape from to return to the supreme deity. And that was their explanation of why there is evil in the world. There's evil in the world because the God that made the world is bad, and he has nothing to do with the true supreme God. So these people, the Sethians, saw Jesus as a heavenly being who came to earth to reveal the way back to the supreme deity. So that's why Jesus is an important character in the Sethian myth. He's connected to salvation, but not in the same way as the proto-Orthodox. So, now, how do we know that the author was one of these people, the Sethians? So, we're going to give 3 reasons to think that the author of the Gospel of Judas was indeed a Sethian Gnostic. Well, the first one is very interesting, and it is the critique of the proto-Orthodox, or the early Catholic Christians. So this author is clearly criticizing the proto-Orthodox Christians, specifically their idea of apostolic succession, or the idea that knowledge comes from putting faith in the tradition as passed along by the apostles. So the way he starts off the story is that he shows that the 12 disciples are celebrating the Eucharist, and Jesus shows up and sees them doing this, and he laughs because he is saying that they're doing something wrong. He says, well, you don't know what you're doing, but it is by this that your God will be praised. And as you can imagine, the disciples are confused because they think that Jesus is the Son of God, or as they say, the Son of our God. But Jesus' words imply that his God is different from their God, whereas the disciples believe that the God of Jesus is the same God that they're worshiping with the Eucharist. But Jesus is telling them that that is not true. So anyway, the text later makes clear that the disciples' God is actually this evil lower God who created the world, not the transcendent God of Jesus. So what's the second reason? Well, the text promotes esoteric knowledge, which is also something that the Gnostic Sethians promoted. So whereas the proto-Orthodox Christians believed in public knowledge and the universal availability of salvation, the Sethians actually believed in private or esoteric knowledge, and only those who accessed it had a chance of being saved. The esotericism of the Sethians is exemplified by the fact that Jesus talks with Judas alone. And again, you can see another example from the text here, from lines 23 through 25. Jesus says to Judas, "Separate from them, and I will tell you the mysteries of the kingdom." And you can see here's the Coptic for those of you who are into that. And I didn't explain before, but actually this is the mark I'm using to separate lines. I know that really comes from poetry, but it was just for the sake of convenience. This is not in the original transcript or the text of the Gospel of Judas. So now, the third reason that we know that the author of the Gospel of Judas was a Sethian Gnostic, and it, of course, is that he literally gives you the Sethian Gnostic myth. So he can't really be anybody else. He's supporting the views that the Sethians have. So in the text, during this secret revelation that Jesus gives to Judas, he pretty much explains all of cosmology to him. There's a boundless realm, and it's seen by no angelic race. The great invisible spirit generated a bunch of beings, which generated more beings, and these beings generated heavens all the way down to earth, and there is a total of 72 heavens. And then at the end of this, Adam is made, and he begets Seth, which is the father of the imperishable race. And the problem with the world is that the God that made the world, it's called Nebro or Yaldabaoth, is bad. So the world is a place that needs to be escaped. The material world is fundamentally bad. So if the author was Sethian, then where did he live? That's a hard question to discuss, but I have a map here so that we can point out some of the places that might be suggested. There's little attestation among the ancient sources, and scholars debate among themselves about where the Gnostics might have been. But around the year 375 AD, which would be maybe 200 years after Judas was written, Epiphanius of Salamis, who is on the proto-Orthodox side of things, said that they existed only in Egypt and in Palestine. So down here in Egypt and then over here in Palestine, right? So, or more like there, yeah. Anyway, but he also says that earlier they existed as far north as Armenia. And I don't have Armenia on the map up here, but it's farther north here. Those of you who are relatively cultured and know a little bit about world geography probably know that Armenia is at the kind of near the top of Turkey, basically, that kind of area. And actually, it was more like this kind of area, really, because I see Edessa here. So maybe I'm the uncultured one here that's forgetting things. But anyway, so those are our guesses about where the author might have lived. But anyway, so the author, well, let's give these concluding remarks. The author of the Gospel of Judas was a 2nd century Sethian Gnostic who was highly critical of the proto-Orthodox Christians. The author was not Judas, and demonstrably so, it was not Judas. As interesting as that might be, unfortunately, it is not true. So my apologies to the conspiracy theorists out there. So he wrote the Gospel to ridicule the idea of public knowledge, that was associated with the Orthodox Christians. So he said that the Christians who relied on apostolic authority were tricked into worshiping the lower creator God rather than the supreme God worshipped by the Sethians. And where did he live? We don't know, but the possibilities include some of the places that we know the Sethians lived. But anyway, that's the end of the video, and I appreciate that you watched it, and I will see you next time.